Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come in, take your virtual seats. We're about to begin. Thank you so much for joining us today, wherever you're dialing in from. Welcome to our esteemed expert panel. Today, we're going to talk about, is it worth it, making the transition from legacy to legal? So thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to start by introducing our expert panel. First, we have Cheryl Wilson. Cheryl is the woman behind Cannabis, a well-being centered cannabis operation that is licensed for micro-cultivation, medical sales, and microprocessing. Cheryl started from a medical use license and has grown her operations from there. She'll be the first to tell you that scaling a cannabis operation from a personal project to a commercial business is no small feat. So we're really excited to have Cheryl here today to hear all of her insights. Janine Davis has an extensive corporate and startup experience in a number of high-value regulated industries, such as tobacco, construction, and greenhouse produce. She has over 19 years of cannabis industry experience, and since 2018 has focused primarily on working with legacy market growers to transition to the legal space. She is the co-founder of a small batch craft brand called Bud Coast, and she works as the National Director of Sales at Joint Venture Craft Cannabis. Thanks for joining us, Janine. Lucas McCann is the co-founder and chief scientific officer at CannDelta, a leading regulatory and scientific consulting firm specializing in cannabis and psychedelics compliance. Lucas has a PhD in organic chemistry, and prior to founding CannDelta, he worked as part of the medical cannabis program at Health Canada. CannDelta offers special consulting programs for micro-licensing and nurseries, and to date, they have helped over 100 applicants of all sizes get licensed and stay on Health Canada's good side, which, as we all know, is a huge challenge. So we're excited to have Lucas here today to share his insights. And Devin Sears. Devin is the Senior Director of Operations at LabStat and LabSmart. There, Devin is responsible for the development and validation of new analytical methodologies used for product testing across the cannabis and natural health product portfolios. Devin is also responsible for method development and validation for natural health products, including vitamins, supplements, and herbal products. Devin has a PhD in physical chemistry, and prior to joining LabStat LabSmart in 2019, he spent more than a decade as a senior research scientist developing analytical methodologies for the assessment of pharmaceutical ingredients. So we're excited to have Devin to share all his insights as well. Thanks so much, everybody. It's great to see you all today.
Hi. Good morning.
Okay, yeah, I wish we were doing this in person like the good old days, but thanks for joining me virtually. This is the new way of doing these panels, so really excited to have you all here. Let's jump in. Lucas, I want to start with you. I think there's a general misconception of sorts in the industry that being a micro licensee is somehow easier or requires less paperwork or investment than a standard operator. Can you speak to some of the real differences between micro and standard and some of the unique challenges that micro licensees face during the licensing process?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So there is that there is some truth to that statement for sure. There are some leniencies that exist for micro license holders. The easements that we'll be looking at for micros will typically revolve around features like physical security and in the regular fees that Health Canada will charge a micro operator. They're a whole order of magnitude less than what a standard operator would be charged with. The caveat to that is that if you're operating a micro cultivation license with a micro processing license, and a sales for medical purposes licenses, then that can actually void your easement that you would have in physical security, and you'll be required in most cases to implement visual monitoring retention. And the retention, as we all know, servers are very expensive. That can easily tack on with the cameras an extra 100K to your site build out. Micros are typically smaller, so 5,000 square feet is the sort of the sweet spot for that. So in terms of the actual build, you are held to the same standards for good production practices, and your reporting and record keeping, even sanitation logs, all have to be done in much the same way as a standard operator. So what are the advantages to operating as a micro? It could be a faster build out, but at the end of the day, you're going to be filling out the same forms and recording the same data and be subject potentially to inspections, all the same as you would a standard. Plus to that is you can always start as a micro, get licensed on a cheaper build, and then once you've made a few bucks, start implementing some of those physical security measures, and then have your new application go in for a standard, and they'd repeal your micro and give you the standard later on down the road, which is an excellent strategy for a lot of folks that want to do a phased approach to build.
Wow, that's really interesting. So how many people are you seeing who come in thinking they want to be micro end up choosing some other version of the licensing based on sort of their long-term goals?
So surprisingly enough, been in several conversations with folks that have wanted to start with the micro path initially. When they started to see what the initial investment was going to look like and where they would be long term, and then recognizing that there's not necessarily a time saving that's significant between the licensing path for micro and standard, a lot of them have chosen to go standard right off the hop. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best thing to do. It's going to depend a lot on your site and how much available real estate you have to expand and to build out. Having said that, we're working with some folks that are in Scarborough. They're building a shop on top of a mechanics area, and they're relatively landlocked in about 3,000 square feet. They wanted to go standard because they said that they already had cameras, and we dissuaded them. We told them it's not going to be worth it for you guys. Your fees will be higher, and you have nowhere to build out. You can't build up or out because you're on the second floor of a pre-constructed building. Go micro. It'll save you a lot in the long run.
It's really interesting. Janine, you have anything to add there? I know you work with a lot of micros, and I'm curious how you help people determine which versions of the license they might want to go after in the beginning.
100% everybody should do a scaled approach. I mean, you get to walk before you run, and to do an amendment to your license is a very short process. As far as expense, I actually have to say, I believed that you had to have $2 million or $1 or $2 million to build a micro 2. And still, I started seeing that you don't. So for example, there's a nursery that I helped achieve license in Cranbrook, total startup cost $150K. Joint venture Craft Cannabis just got a micro license, total startup cost $80K. It's all contained within one 40-foot CCAN. So it's really about how big of an operation you want and how you want to scale it. You can always amend your license to add additional spaces, but my advice is get a foot in the door.
Really great insights, guys. Thanks for that. So Cheryl, as our resident micro licensee, I'm curious, it kind of begs the question, and it's the title of our entire event, is it worth it? You started as someone who had a medical license, and now you've transitioned. You have your cultivation, your medical sales, and your processing. I'm curious, what were your initial motivations of making the crossover and going fully legal, and how's it going so far?
So I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I am doing exactly what Lucas suggested. I started small, foot in the door, like Janine said, foot in the door, and then it's my intention to grow from there. I started with just getting my cultivation, then I went to processing, or medical sales, and then I got processing a couple of weeks ago. And I'm in the grind right now to get the sales amendment ironed out so that I can move towards farm gate. It's been a long grind. It has been far more expensive than I thought it would be. I tried to take what I had learned from growing in a tent to 2,500 square feet, and it's a whole different ballgame. I didn't know I would need air conditioners in January, but here we were. And that was a $60,000 expense that I wasn't expecting. So there's been some surprises along the way. It's been far more expensive than I thought it would be. It's been far more time consuming than I thought it would be. And then you throw COVID in on top of that, and it's really been a challenge. So from having employees, I've zeroed right back down to just me. It's just me in the grow, and I do everything myself. Now, fortunately, I'm just growing right now. I'm not trimming or doing anything like that. So it's been okay, but it's been a lot more work than I thought it would be. I was not really a legacy grower, so I can't speak to transitioning from legacy into legal, but the warning should be that there is a great expense there that you don't see coming.
You know, you mentioned human capital. Human capital, I think, as any small business can be such a huge expense, and it's one of the expenses that, as you grow, it has to be real consideration as you add more people to the team. You just talked about how you've gone back down to just yourself. What has that been like in terms of finding people who are qualified in the ways that you need them to be, but also being able to afford to hire people in to help you?
My growers are my daughters, and they were legacy. So they learned to grow in the Kootenays, and they came back here. And when COVID started, of course, the last person I want to risk is my daughters. And so I said, just stay home. And when this is over, we'll get back at it. So it's been beneficial for me to just be me in the grow, and I can handle what I'm doing. And it doesn't even take a full 8-hour day for one person to do it. So it's been okay. It's not been terribly taxing that way. And the girls are ready to come back in when it's time.
And you mentioned you're just doing growing at the moment. You're not doing trimming or processing. Do you outsource the rest of those operations?
I was awake last night at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out exactly how I'm going to do this trimming process, because the plants tell you when it's time. So I think I'm about 3 or 4 weeks from doing the wet trim and then hanging. I was awake trying to figure out what the hell am I going to do. So
I wonder maybe Janine or Lucas, you can pop in here about that sort of human capital and the doing stuff yourself versus outsourcing, wondering sort of what strategies you've seen work for others.
Janine, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, I personally do believe that it can be a huge advantage to harness legacy industry participants to come in on a cannabis operation to consult. And I've set a lot of people from my hometown up in Nelson with those positions. My entire sales team within joint venture, it's all women from the legacy space that I've transitioned into legal roles. And why is that? There's a higher knowledge of the plant. Many of these women have done 15 or 10 to 15 years plant work. So I do think that if you can hire people from the legacy space to come in that could teach you how to do the lollipopping, the pruning, the hang dry and the hand trim, people that are fast, and just to bring them into your operation to help with the harvest. And I can say all of the successful micros that have gone to market have employed this strategy, and the quality of their product, well, you guys know it speaks for itself.
If I could jump in there and add a quick point to that, Rachel, if that's all right. There are two considerations, I think, when looking at human capital. Micros typically are smaller spaces that run very, very lean. The challenge there is that, especially for when getting a microprocessing license or considering the path of getting a microprocessing license, you'll need someone that satisfies the conditions for what Health Canada is looking for. They'll need to fulfill the academic requirements and have experience. Running lean operations, I think, is great. It's great if you can bring in some of that legacy knowledge and experience. The challenge is melding that with the regulatory aspect and the paper filling, because typically there are less people there to be able to do the compliance piece and the record keeping. That can sometimes mean that you're filling out paperwork all day and getting very little time to actually attend to the plant. So always a consideration there when talking about operating lean.
100%.
mm-hmm.
So that's kind of getting started in licensing. I mean, just sort of a quick snippet on some of the things to consider there. Janine, I know you work with a lot of clients then on go-to-market strategies, like once you're actually licensed, how do you get your product picked up by a province, a retailer, and actually out to the customers? I'm curious what your recommendations are when you think about dealing with all the different provinces, balancing the challenges of private and public retail in some places, and now farm gate being a possibility for some in some regions as well. Where do you see the greatest paths to profitability for micro licenses coming into the game at this stage when it's already so competitive?
Well, I mean, everybody has not really, we should speak to the pricing compression that happened in 2021. It was so fast and furious. When you see, brands that have reduced their MSRP from $49.99 in 2020 to $29.99 an eighth in 2021, and from $44.99 down to $36.99, really, well-known brands like Broken Coast. And so this has been across the board in every province. The first thing micros have to do is they have to manage expectations on pricing. So the good news is, it shouldn't be a lot to manage, because the first thing they need to wrap their head around, I've found people that have transitioned in, is wrapping their head around, I'm not going to make the same after tax as I did pre-legal when I wasn't paying tax. That's not going to happen. You're not going to get paid way more in legal cannabis, but you are going to not have your freedom at risk. So when we're looking at getting to market, I think initially having a wholesaling strategy can work on your first couple crops. Figure out what you're doing. Let somebody else figure out how it's going to get to market and how to promote it. You don't have to worry about social media. You don't have to worry about your website. After you do a couple wholesale transactions, then you could look at launching into something where you're having your story told. But if you always remain a wholesaler, that's never going to raise like the fair market value of your product, right? If you are going to sell into a brand, make sure that brand's telling your story, right? This was grown by Cannabis. She's in Ontario. It's a female-run operation. Her daughters with legacy roots in the Kootenays are part of it. And then they're telling the story of Cheryl and Cannabis that's raising her profile and also kind of raising the wholesale value of her product as it gets out there and it gets known. So I find a lot of people that like to buy wholesale from micros like to pass the product off as if it's their own or if they grew it. And that's not really helping the micro get their name out of there, so to speak, and raise the fair market value. Getting registered in the provinces is quite a process. It's a mini step process. Just getting through the category manager, that's step one. Then you get kicked to registration, kicked to logistics, you have to get a delivery date. So expect delays. We're working within an inefficient system with about 7 more stops along the route than you would have in the legacy market.
Some really great points there. I'm interested, Cheryl, like what you folks are thinking about your path to market and what that's been like to consider, like Janine is saying, the difference between going wholesale or trying to make your own brand and tell your own story. What is your plan in terms of your path to market?
I've gone wholesale and I'm working with somebody that wants to talk about what Kinhana is. So that works for me.
So you started with the wholesale to, just like Janine say, get the money, get your biomass out the door, and get your operation set up until you can get your feet under you.
Yes, that's worked for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart strategy for sure. Like we said before, this scaling your business over time, not trying to swallow the whole elephant at once, as they say.
And there are processors. I've worked with I've negotiated with some processors that I didn't want to work with. And then I just kept going through the process of finding the right team to work with, just culling through the masses to try and find somebody that sort of had the same vision that I did. And that was the group that I'm working with now.
That's great. It's important to find great partners to work with. I mean, and I think what we're all saying too is it's important to work with experts like all of you who can offer experience on the ways that this could be done, should be done to expedite your learning curves and to get you faster to success. I think that's definitely a good strategy to have here in cannabis. Devin, I want to come to you because I think, we've talked about, Janine touched a little bit on how difficult it is just to get your product listed. And there's so many considerations for what kind of products are being listed on the market now. There's a lot of glut of sort of same, but there's also this conversation around the value of THC percentage and terpene percentage. And many of the provincial buyers have set sort of these minimum thresholds for THC and kind of won't buy anything under a certain value. Now, there's a whole other conversation we could have, of course, on whether or not THC equals good quality cannabis. And I know that we'd all have much to say about that. But as one of the leading labs in the country, and as the man who is responsible for validating methods and making sure your information is accurate, what is your greatest advice to a micro in terms of finding an ethical lab that is producing validated information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, it's, spending the time with the lab. So we are unfortunately a necessary evil, right? I mean, it's not something everybody wants to do. Nobody really wants to pay money to have their samples tested, but it's necessary. So it really boils down to spending time with the lab and understanding how they're conducting the tests and, how transparent are they in things like sample prep, things like their method development and validation, how they report the data. Understanding all of the nuance can be a little daunting, but it's a conversation that you have to have. You have to understand, are they prepping, how are we, for example, we prep sample by taking whole plant, right? So we would homogenize the whole plant to conduct our tests. So how are they prepping their sample? How is the method executed? Has it been validated? What's the accuracy of the method, the repeatability? These are terms that it's in your best interest to kind of understand. And, we've done webinars in the past on, what these terms actually mean. And, I'd encourage people to kind of do their homework, but definitely talk to the lab and get a feeling for how transparent they are. They should be willing to show you all of this information.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk a lot about sampling and how much sampling can be used to skew results in both the sampling from the producer, sort of where they take their sample from the plant itself, but then the sampling from the lab side, like you said, whether or not they grind up everything, whether or not they're taking out certain things to, inflate sort of those values and whatnot. So yeah, I wonder if you can speak to this idea of that Health Canada doesn't actually sort of certify a lab, and so what is it that I'm looking for that gives me indications that a lab is on the up and up in terms of cannabis testing?
Yeah, so yeah, you're right. Health Canada doesn't certify a lab, but a lab can either be what we call ISO certified, or they can operate under GMP. So ISO is an accreditation body. So you would go out to that body, you would present your method validation, you'd participate in what they call a proficiency testing, and then that body would then accredit you for that testing. So under ISO 17025, which is the laboratory testing, you can gain accreditation through participation in their proficiency testing and demonstration of your method validation. You can also operate under good manufacturing processes, which is our procedures, which is that's more of a pharmaceutical. It comes from the pharmaceutical world, and that is subject to Health Canada inspection. So, for example, we are a GMP, not certified, but we are a GMP facility with a drug establishment license. So we are routinely inspected by Health Canada.
Okay. So, and we hear GMP a lot. And so under what circumstances particularly would someone need or want to look for a lab that has that GMP?
GMP is going to be particularly important if you're looking to export. So if you're looking to export out of the country, a lot of countries that you would export to, for example, Europe, Israel, are going to require GMP certification for that export. Within Canada, ISO versus GMP, as long as it's an accredited laboratory or has been inspected and has a GMP drug establishment certificate, the testing's been reviewed and the validation's been reviewed.
Now, this makes me think a lot about the idea of having a QAP, and that being sort of the human capital that we talk about a lot for micros. Many people, how do you afford a full-time QAP? What does it mean to have a QAP on staff? Lucas, I know this is something perhaps you could offer some insights into as well. Does a micro need to employ a QAP full-time in order to have these conversations with a lab in an informed way? Or what kind of recommendations are you making to micros about staying informed on the science side?
Well, I guess it all depends on what their goals are. I mean, if they're looking out to get a processing license, then they'll certainly have to work with a quality assurance person. As we alluded to before, quality assurance people have certain qualifications and experience that they have to satisfy. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to employ that person full time. You can share quality assurance people as long as we can demonstrate in an application that that person is working around a few different facilities in an area. We have a time schedule that makes sense for them, and we can show that they can conduct their duties in a way that would be compliant. Then that's something that would fly. But not everyone is going to be next to maybe another cultivator that they'd be able to share their QAP. So it's really important to work with people that understand the science and the regulations that can guide you in a way. Labs are great at doing that. Consultants are great at doing that, and there are a lot of independent people that you can engage to help. Engaging with people that have done this before is another great way, like Cheryl and her team, and being part of those conversations as well. But you have to pay for education, unfortunately, and that's something that comes with a price tag. And on top of that, experience is probably the most important aspect of it, because if they don't have that cannabis experience, all the education in the world isn't going to make much of a difference if they don't know sort of what context they're working in, what documents to fill out, and how to think bigger picture. And that's where you'll really save on a more expensive person, is having someone that understands things so they can implement more efficient process flows in your facility.
We hear the word process a lot. Processes seem to be a really important part of getting this whole game right for the long term.
Yeah, definitely is. process is going to be king. You want to make sure that even from just moving product through your facility, that's going to be something that makes sense, is as linear as possible. And if that's something that you're, if GMP is something you're working towards, that's probably already going to be baked in, I think, to the way that your facility is constructed anyway. That's definitely something that we set up for sure for folks, but having a solid set of standard operating procedures is going to ensure that not only are things moving in the right way, but people are also moving in the right way and ticking all their boxes off on their weekly checklist of things to do.
Yeah, and towards that too, the quality professionals, so your QAP and your testing labs, you really should be looking for someone that thinks like a regulator, not necessarily thinks like a user. Because this is where the regulators are going to start drilling down, is on your testing, on your quality procedures, on your quality systems.
We've been hearing kind of chatter about potentially, more stringent rules around testing and things like that. What do you see as kind of because Devin, you come from a real pharmaceutical background, and I'm curious what you see as kind of the future of cannabis testing, what people should be expecting that they'll be required to do in the next year or 5 as cannabis really becomes a full-fledged industry.
I think as products become more refined, so where we go from raw plant to edibles 2.0 products into 3.0 products, marrying up with nutraceuticals, the closer we get, especially in the 3.0, the closer we get to making a label claim, the more stringent the regulations are going to become. And so I think people just need to kind of get ready for the fact that, testing regulations are going to tighten. Expectations around their operations may tighten as well.
So let's jump off from that, because certainly the 2.0, 3.0, I don't even know which 0.0 we're at anymore, is heating up. We're starting to see some really interesting delivery methods, but those kind of developing formulations for things like bath bombs and creams is really different than growing a plant. And so I'm curious, again, given your expertise, when you think about creating a formula that has multiple constituents that likely come then from multiple suppliers, what's some advice that you would give to people when thinking about kind of vetting suppliers and thinking about their supply chain in making a 2.0 or 3.0 product?
Yeah, I would really have 2 pieces of advice. One is, institute proper supply chain management, and 2, start working with an analytical lab early on in your product development so that they can make sure that their methods are developed and ready for your product. So from a supply chain standpoint, obviously, if you take a topical, for example, you're going to need a base and then you have your active, and testing both constituents prior to the formulation is going to be a requirement, and then testing final product. The issue really is going to be at the final product stage, where you have the combination of all your excipients and your active, and then does your analytical method appropriately separate out all of those components? If you just dump this product on your testing lab at the end, there's no guarantee that their method will be able to cope with, the extensive array of excipients that may be in your product.
And it would stand to reason, again, this goes back to like, not all labs are created equal. So just because a lab can effectively test your whole flower, if you start making 2.0 products, doesn't necessarily mean they have the methodology or the equipment to test those types of products as well.
Right. And that's where, again, getting to know your lab and having conversations with them about what products you intend to produce, and, are their methods capable? Have they worked with those types of products before? If they have they validated or verified the sample preparation for those types of products is critically important.
Rachel, could I jump in there as well? I mean, one thing that I wanted to point out is that if your business model and you're at the time where you're considering maybe even getting a license or not, there's something you can achieve through Health Canada with a research license to test your formulation and to test your, the products that you're actually looking to intend to produce and sell. Can be an awesome avenue to explore. It's much less expensive. You require very little in terms of build out, and a locked cabinet and minimal amount of in your possession would be enough to effectively get approved for that kind of formulation study. That's a way better way if you're still on the edge about whether or not this is the direction you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point, Lucas. And we've actually seen more and more brands start picking up that research license to do that idea of being able to test. I also think with pheno hunting, even on the whole flower side, that ability to really have that full sensory experience of your product before you release it to the market is, I'm seeing a real great differentiator for some brands now as well. So kind of hunting for the next great thing.
Yeah,
Lucas,
and sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I do have quite a bit of, I call them the makers in the legacy space that are looking to get involved now. Is that a form of license you would encourage them to achieve before they go ahead and get the micro processing to get the research license, and they can start to get their feet wet around regulation?
There's a few slices of this research license that can be leveraged. I mean, you can submit a protocol that allows for a few things. So, formulation can be one if we're talking about 2.0, 3.0. Cultivation can be a whole other one. But also with what Health Canada has recently allowed with organoleptic studies, that gives you the opportunity to grow and to actually sample and taste, and as well as anybody else that might be interested in your product or your brand. Before you need to package it and sell it off to a wholesaler. That could be extremely valuable. Even someone that's working towards processing or a sales amendment, and even if they're not, even if they're just already licensed, they want to know what they're putting out into the market. That research license to allow for you to bring something to the boardroom and effectively sample it there is fantastic. It's a great way to get investor interest, and it's where the cannabis industry is heading. It's creating cannabis as a destination. It's allowing people to come to a site, tour a site, sample products right there on the site, right? Barring any kind of smoking regulations. We have smoke-free Ontario in Ontario, but you can use the parking lot in front of the building, and then these folks can exit through the gift shop, which is the cannabis retail farm gate store that they'd have, they're right there on site. So, being able to mimic what we've seen in wineries and in the alcohol industry is definitely a future for cannabis, and it's where things are heading for sure.
Wow, there you go, folks. Lucas just gave you a whole business plan right there. It's really exciting though. And I actually think, Janine, you brought up a great thing, and maybe we can touch on this a little bit, is the legacy makers who have a formulation. So they don't necessarily need to have a full production facility of their stuff, but they have something that has been successful in the legacy space that they now want to bring to market. I'm curious if you can offer how you've seen that go, or what strategies are working really well for those people, how to find the right partners who also want to bring your product to life.
If I could be completely honest, I haven't seen a lot of them find too many of the right partners. I saw a lot of large publicly traded companies want to gobble these brands up and use them for promotion and talk about what they did in the legacy space. We've seen very few actually make it across the finish line, and even fewer that are actually making things for themselves. Like, aside from extracts, we have seen rosin, we've seen hash. We're hopefully going to see more, of the vape pens, that sort of thing. But when it comes to like the small batch topicals and edibles, very, very few have made it across the finish line. I think it's something that more starting to get involved now, because sales have actually been down 40 to 60% across the board on the illicit side, as we're taking more market share legally. So, there's a renewed interest in transition. And so I haven't seen a lot make it across. So I can't speak to that. Maybe Lucas, you might have worked with more than I of the makers.
We have, and we're working with a few. There's that continued challenge of, if they go down this licensing path, they have to stop going to the farmers market that they've been going to, selling the CBD healing products, sort of under the table, I guess, right? So it's still a constant struggle that people are trying to work through, and to do things like satisfy zoning variances, to be able to afford and build out the lab or the space, the kitchen that they would need in their facility are still big challenges for them, and it's something that they struggle with. Most importantly, I would say, because like once you make that commitment, you have to go in 100%. You can't do both. You can't produce these products, Monday to Friday for the OCS or the LCRB, and then on the weekend go and take care of the unregulated products and sell them at a farmer's market table. So you're all in or you're all out.
I don't smoke cannabis, but I do use it for pain control. And I've never enjoyed smoking cannabis, but I infuse it. and I have had tremendous success with infusing. And I've actually applied for a patent for my product, and I'm in the patent process. And I have found another processor that wants to, they're a lot bigger than me, and they want to take it on as their initial project. So I'm working with a lab to create the formulas to perfect the ingredients, the active and the carrier. And I expect that we'll see it on the market here at the tail end of this year or springtime.
So I'm interested, Cheryl, tell me a little bit more about that. How did you decide, or like, what's the tipping point for going from, growing an agricultural product to actually making a 2.0 or 3.0 product? What was the impetus for that? Or
trying to figure out how to get it into me because I don't smoke. So I was trying to figure out how to ingest it so that I could benefit from the qualities that cannabis brings. And so it brought me to honey. And that's the formula that I've used for it. I mean, there's all kinds of honey and cannabis on the market, but I do it with hash. And so it's a little more of a unique way of blending the two of them together. And this other processor has a larger facility, and it's a time-consuming process to go through it, as what Janine was saying, that some haven't made it across the finish line. And I think if I had to do it all myself, I don't know that I would be as far along the pathway as I am. And so having somebody else take that part on to experiment with it while I can still grow and do the things that I enjoy over there, but still sort of have my hand in it and oversee it and make recommendations as to what it should be. And there's a big part of that is the lab too. So.
Or would you do it again?
The jury's out on that. I do think I would. I see light at the end of the tunnel, and I do think I would do it again. But I'm in a different situation than a lot of people. This is not my one and only, and so I've got other income streams to fortify what's going on in the cannabis business.
Cheryl brings up a great point in that, some of this is research and development, and research is, it's not a certainty. There's going to be a lot of failures before you have that one hit. And so that needs to be baked in, especially if you're looking at a 2.0 or a 3.0 product where you're developing, that needs to be baked into your business plan.
Careful, Devin. You don't want to tell people they should do their own research.
That's a fair statement.
Well, but it's a great point. We all heard sort of the chatter when beverages first came out, how a couple of the bigger brands had some challenges with their beverage formulations and the linings of the can and like all of these things. So even when you presumably have lots of money and the experts to do research and development, there's unexpected things that can happen along the way. That's why they call it research and not perfection, I suppose. But I'm curious if anyone, Lucas or Cheryl, if you have anything else to add to that idea of determining when or if you will add to your productization. So if you start as a cultivator, as many of the micros do, what is that process of diversifying one's offering to the market? And are you making recommendations that they look at that long term, or what's that conversation usually like with the micros?
I don't know what Janine would say, but I would say stick to what you know and don't try and do too much.
I think there's a very interesting case to be made of when North 40, Gord Nickel from North 40 Cannabis was the first micro to get out of the gate producing, that I had really seen be vocal on the social media landscape about his journey. And you saw that Gord was able to do a strategic pivot when he had flower that he produced that he didn't feel would fit a premium product. Instead of selling it as a premium product and having a disappointed consumer base, he pivoted into making rosins and hash rosin. And that was a very, very smart strategic pivot where he, had more than one product offering. So I think that there are opportunities for micros to do that. But when we're talking more on things on the formulation side, rather than just something made from cannabis flower, that's going to get quite a bit more complicated. And that is not a pivot that can be done quickly or efficiently. It takes time.
It's a really great point. And now I see that he's pivoted sort of once again and is going direct with medical sales.
Yes.
So it's interesting. And I think it's going to be a really unique case study to really see sort of what that's like. I know that's a consideration for many micros in the early days. Certainly when people call me and talk about branding, you know, we talk a lot about which avenues and where can you make a name for yourself and where can you be known for something. And like you said, it's difficult. I agree, Lucas. I think my best advice is always stick with what you know best and be an expert in what you're an expert in before you try and take on other things. But I think there's such a challenge with the price compression, with the minimum THC values that are being demanded by some of the buyers in the market, that many micros are having a challenge really competing at the scale that they need to compete to. You know, and I think if you aren't like a Gord Nickel or Cheryl, who's got a real unique story that you can put behind who you are and get people excited about to buy into what you're doing, it can be a real challenge to just differentiate yourself enough to get to market if you try and get there yourself anyways.
Yeah, you can't sell your brand, but you can sell your story and you can sell who you are. And that's how folks are getting around that branding hurdle.
Right.
Absolutely.
Lucas, conversations about quality and genetics, of course, are what we all talk about at nauseum these days, especially with the, you know, gluttony of biomass that we have, you know, around, and sort of everybody trying to figure out what do the provincial distributors want? What does the customer want? I know you guys offer some consulting around these areas. I'm wondering just a couple key tips around how might a cultivator evaluate their source for genetics or the genetics they have on hand? And more specifically, how do they design a cultivation system that then gets them the greatest results out of those genetics they might be working with?
Yeah, cultivation consulting is a very important area next to licensing. You know, you want to make sure you have good command of your product, and depending on what your experience was before legalization, that could be something that makes or breaks you. So there are a number of folks that offer services in this as well, but you want to make sure that, one, you've got a good process in for making sure that you're managing your regulatory requirements, your record keeping. You know, optimizing your process flow, that should have been done with optimizing the layout for your facility to make sure that you're not sort of going across your site, you know, with the pallet jack moving things around when things could have sort of been in a more linear way. Implementing a good pheno hunting program is super important. That can be done with a research license or your cultivation license. A lot of research can be conducted actually under, you know, your cultivation or processing license as well. But one of the challenges that we have here in Health Canada will say a bunch of different things on this. We've cornered them into a room where we've, you know, or a corner and said, you know, look, give us a straight answer on the 10.2 declaration. And still we hear from other folks in the industry that Health Canada has said different things. But one of the challenges here, the 10.2 declaration is the non-declaration, I guess you could say, of starting material. Just, you know, the plants that by divine manifestation show up on your, you know, at your facility on the day of licensing. And that is the official answer. It has to be on the day that you get your license, not 5 days, not a month later, like within that 24-hour period. The challenge is there that if those are coming in from an illicit source, which is fine, they're coming into a license to become part of that regulated market, is that depending on the record keeping style that source was provided, and I guess I'll get into this in a sec, we worked with an outdoor cultivator, large 32-acre lot, brought a whole bunch of formerly illicit, now regulated product in with their 10.2 declaration, all legal through the right channels, or through the proper channels using Health Canada's framework. They have rows and rows of different cultivars, and even within those rows, there is a huge amount of variation. You know, some are tall, some are short, some are bushy, some are very slender. The fan leaves are different. The color is different. One's forest green, one's emerald, one's light green, fluorescent green. So depending on those record keeping styles, I mean, you could be calling this, you know, a pink kush or, you know, a gelato, but it might be something completely different, like, you know, a Duke Nukem. So, you know, having that option to do that phenotyping, I think, is going to be very important. We've catered far too long to the high THC consumers. We need to start educating and informing about the other benefits of other cannabinoids that exist, the CBGs, the CBNs, the CBCs that exist in the plant, but also, you know, talking about terpenes. that's something that, you know, contributes not only to flavor profile, but also to the observed effects that you have as well. You know, there's been a huge amount of the industry bending over backwards to these kinds of shoppers. We need to stop doing it. It's leading to genetic drift in the markets for what's actually being produced, and you know, it's not good for industry, and it's not actually beneficial for the people that are actually using it. At the end of the day, the end users are not benefiting from it.
Amen to that. I'm sure everyone on this call would agree to those things. Devin?
Well, I think long term, you're also going to see the implementation of ID techniques like genetic fingerprinting and metabolomic fingerprinting come into play for authenticity purposes.
Yeah, so I mean that's where I was thinking too, sort of the whole blockchain idea. And I know that, you know, Shoppers Drug Mart, who is a major buyer on the medical side, you know, certainly is really concerned about those things and has made that quite well known. The idea, I hear it from the buyers, the provincial buyers all the time, like, well, you know, your cut of GG4, who knows that it's actually Gorilla Glue? Everybody's selling it. You know, nobody's got a real cut. What does that really mean? And certainly in the early days, you know, there were many people who are bringing in product from different places and changing the names and calling them things. And so there's a great question as to you know, we went through also through the early stage where brands changed the names to like calling it their own stuff. You know, Tweed changed all of the names to their own things. And then we saw sort of a backlash from the legacy people saying, well, you know, then I don't know what it is and I'm not able to compare. And bud tenders really love to have the original strain names, but it still begs the question, you know, is that true genetics that are actually, especially if they're coming from the legacy market, that someone could prove or track in some kind of way? Lucas, is that something that you expect to see or that is coming up more often, this idea of being able to verify the genetics that you have?
There are a few companies that offer this kind of fingerprinting using spectroscopy methods. I mean, I think the whole industry probably needs to create new standards, and it's difficult because from the legacy market, again, record keeping is very important. There are, in terms of cultivars, actually, you know, 5 different sour diesels that exist, and they've done this with some genetic mapping. So it's like, even though you think you know, you actually don't know, unfortunately. The nice thing about these old names is that they actually breach the regulations, right? I mean, they appeal to youth, they appeal to, and sorry, not to say that things should appeal to youth. That's not what I'm trying to say, but this is one area in which we've had a little bit of flexibility, is with names of cultivars. And for the record, I don't want things necessarily to appeal to youth whatsoever, but it's nice to see that that kind of aspect of the legacy market has been maintained. There's been something that we've kept. Just the accuracy of that information, you know, is brought into question.
So like, I would like to speak to the genetics and the name game here, guys, because for us to pretend that this is only starting to happen in the legal space this has been happening for 20 years in the illicit space. If somebody had a pack of Death Bubba they couldn't sell and Rockstar was popular, they call it Rockstar. So when people are sourcing clones from the legacy space for their 10-2 declaration, you don't really know what you're getting. You just know that that's what the, legacy cultivator called it. So there's a lot of that we see. And the name game has been going on in the legacy space for so very long. It's now happened a lot in this space as well. More than anything, if I could speak to genetics and how long people are successfully running them, the entire supply chain that I manage is small batch, unique cultivars. So what I'm seeing is after about 6 to 8 months, a cultivar will have a good 6 to 8 month run in one province, and then I'm seeing sales start to decline at the 6 month mark. Sometimes I've even seen it at the 4 month mark. So my advice to the cultivators in my supply chain is have new genetics ready to rock every 4 to 6 months. And once you could actually keep a room of the original genetic and say you maxed it out in the province of BC, you could then move it into Alberta. And hopefully you have a bunch of positive reviews from Reddit, from bud tenders, from Instagram to back up that SKU listing. Then you could move it into Ontario. But you're going to need to bring something fresh into BC once you see those sales decline. So every 4 to 6 months, swap out your genetics, make sure you have something new and exciting, and move your genetics around the provinces in such a way that they're not becoming stale.
Yeah, I feel like that whole part of the go-to-market strategy is the full-time job of making that plan, and really, especially for the smaller producers who have a limited footprint, being able to pheno hunt, R&D, and grow out enough biomass to make that happen, I think is the real like matrix of overlapping circles of trying to really figure out that strategy of, and again, the buyers being so unique in each one of those markets, which the appetite each one of them might have for a genetic, or especially for a 2.0 product, is so different. BC almost couldn't be more different than Ontario in terms of how they look at buying something like whole flower, and even the process that they go through. I think that you've just hit the nail on the head, Janine. Like that matrix right there of decision making is really what's going to float or sink your business. I think even for the mid-size operators that that I often work with, that's the number one challenge of this game right now, is getting that mix nailed down.
I mean, in contrast with a lot of large LPs, I mean, they devote huge, 1,000 square foot large grow rooms to one single cultivar, and there's several of them in a row. So I guess if you're able to do that, maybe to Janine's point, you'll have a better chance of sustaining longer than maybe some of the big LPs in terms of cultivating quad product and getting it out there. That's a neat point.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting ways to be successful and to give the big guys a run for their money. Cheryl?
As a micro, you, at least for me, I did my first round of Pink Kush and it gave me absolute fits. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to grow. Now I've got it dialed in, and I'm going to do one more run of it, and then I'm done with Pink Kush, and I'm going to learn on something else now. So it's almost like your first, in my situation, the first run is a real learning curve. Your second run, you're comfortable with it. You know what the plant needs, you know what it wants, you know the timing on it, and then you get comfortable with it. Then it's time to switch to something else that somebody else is more comfortable with or wants to buy. And going back to talk about the high THC, it seems to me like I get nurseries calling me, and that's the first thing they talk about is how high their THC is.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge, Cheryl, like what you're saying, because they'll often sell that genetic to you based on the C of A of their pheno they're growing in-house. But like you've just said, you take those clones now and bring them to your environment, and that plant's going to behave potentially very differently. And so then dialing it in your environment to get the results that you need out of it can take time to, like you said, take 2, 3, 4 cycles. And for micros, the space and the time that takes can be very, very challenging to do.
Yes. Yeah, because you don't have 10 rooms and you can dedicate one room to experimenting with this one strain that you want to introduce to your line. You've got, most of us have 1 room or 2 rooms, and that's it. And you're going hard guns to keep up.
Devin or Lucas, I'm curious in that kind of specific buying from a nursery or buying genetics from someone else, some highlights, tips, what should they be looking for? I mean, beyond THC, what kinds of attributes or conversations should they be having with the people they buy genetics from? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, you got to do your vendor qualification on these guys too. Make sure you see a copy of the license, I would say. Proper record keeping's got to be maintained. I would look for just a high number library. Folks that have a lot of different cultivars would be great. Look for things that aren't necessarily that popular, that has the potential to be interesting for the market. Keep things moving. Let's not all do the same cultivar with sort of the same specifications and terpene profiles. I don't know if Devin, you want to add to that.
No, that's spot on. That's exactly what I would say.
Great. Okay, guys, I want to close out the conversation with the one thing we all as humans hesitate to talk about, which is money. So I really want to talk about what's a realistic, as a small business, what's a realistic sort of path to profitability or time that it might take. Cheryl talked about how it has been more of an investment than she anticipated. I think that happens for a lot of small business people, kind of no matter what business you're in. So I'm curious, and everyone can kind of chime in on this, but what is realistic from each one of your perspectives in terms of when does a micro actually start making money working in cannabis? Lucas, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start there. Building can take anywhere from 4 months to a year, depending on what you're starting with. Licensing is going to be 6 to 8 months. You have to build before you can license and submit that application, because you have to submit a video with site evidence. If you want a sales amendment, you're looking at a good 3 to 4 months on top of that. And that's if you're going through in a streamlined process. You can obviously and very, maybe not necessarily easily do these kinds of things on your own. I mean, the value in working with folks that have done this previously, other license holders or other mentors that can guide you, is that this can be, this can be a couple year long process, or it can be a multi-year process. So I guess determining sort of what your timeline to ROI, sort of internally, what you think that would be probably a determining factor of who you're going to have sort of help guide you, if anyone at all. Some folks have done it on their own, and they may have their challenges to speak to. But yeah, from the sales amendment side, I mean, I'd say a good 3 to 4 months before you're rocking and rolling and in charge of your own product and your company's own destiny.
Janine, you have any thoughts to add to that? How long are you seeing it taking for people? I mean, I suppose it depends on the path that they take, but what have you seen so far?
So like totally different situations of build. So I'll just go from the evidence package submission. I think you could see that you would probably, from the time you submit your evidence package, if you can get sooner, but on average, I'm seeing people sell their first crop about 1 year later from when they submit their evidence package. I have seen some sooner, I've seen some later, but about 1 year, if you could know that you'll get paid whatever terms have been negotiated 1 year after your evidence package is submitted, and you need that financial runway. So a lot of these businesses, I think we've seen struggle and nearly fail, and I'm sure Lucas would agree with this, because they haven't had enough OPEX funding. So make sure you have enough capital to cover operations for that first year from when you drop your evidence package. And then you're waiting for license, you're getting your plants in, you're doing your first harvest, and then you're pursuing sales channels.
Yeah, we call that the burn in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Devin, I think a lot of people don't factor in the cost of testing in the early days, and that idea of batch releasing and testing different lots. And I'm wondering if you can just offer a couple of thoughts around ways to save time and money around that idea of in those early days, or as a smaller producer. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so if you're understanding what's required by regulation, so don't over test what you need and report what's required. For products where you're actually formulating, have a strategy around vendor qualification, put in place procedures that allow you to maybe do skip lot testing of your raw materials, for example. These are acceptable practices. They just have to be well proceduralized, and you have to follow your procedures. But you can cut down on the testing burden very quickly by implementing those types of strategies and understanding how, what you need to test for in your final product.
Again, work with an expert. Who knows?
Yep.
Don't guess. Cheryl, I'm going to end with you. I'm just curious, since you're the resident micro who's been there, done that, what piece of advice would you give to your past self with the wisdom you have today?
I would have to agree with Janine. Make sure that you've got the money to see you through that runway. It's a long haul from building out your process, your rooms and your whole facility, to getting licensed and then developing a crop and getting it sold. It's a long span of time.
Not for the faint of heart, as we say.
Not for the faint of heart, and you have to make sure that you're well funded to get through that.
Janine,
it's always more expensive than
as my mother says, plan for everything to be twice as expensive and take twice as long, and then you're probably going to be about right.
That's right.
What Lucas was saying there, I did go through the whole process myself. It took a whole lot longer, and I really didn't know what the hell I was doing. And so it took a lot longer than I thought it would. And if I had known about Lucas's operation at the get-go, I probably would have worked with
Cheryl.
I probably would have.
Endorsement.
I would have been making money faster and recoup some costs instead of stumbling through that whole process myself.
When people ask me why should I hire a consultant, I'm like, well, If you want the cliff notes when you haven't read the book, hire a consultant, or you can read the whole book, struggle through, hope you're studying the right questions and go take the test. But if you want the
Exactly.
cheap
That's
book,
exactly the scenario.
hire Lucas.
Oh, come on, guys.
Oh man, I just love it. It's a love it, guys. No, I think you all make a really great point. I think that stands to reason for any kind of business you might be in. No man or woman is an island. You know, we all need help to raise our businesses. And so I think the faster you can pay for the expert help, no matter what you're up to, you know, the more successful and faster your business will run as it needs to. Thank you so much for all of your fantastic insights. We're going to try and take some Q&A from the audience in the next section. And then everyone, please stick around because we're actually going to open it up, do a fun networking session. And all of you watching who have joined us will be able to turn on your cameras and ask these geniuses your burning questions, which I'm sure you all have tons of now. So if you haven't already, please feel free to pop into the chat any kind of burning question that you have, and we'll take a couple of those before we actually open it up to the full floor.